Woodrow, welcome to Rolling Through Negotiations, brother.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks very much for having me, mate. Pleasure to be here.
It's awesome having you on the podcast. It's not every day that we get true hand-on-heart golden nugget allies like yourself. So perhaps we can start with, what's it like negotiating issues in Aboriginal community as a non-Aboriginal person?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And I might, just before I kick off, might just acknowledge that I'm on beautiful Wadawurrung country in Point Lonsdale, where I'm very lucky to live and work. And pay my respect to elders past and present down here, and you and your family, Matt, and all other mob around Australia. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I've been really conscious of in my work. And I feel very lucky to have worked at the organisations that I have worked in. And I started my sort of what I would call my real work at VAI in Victoria at the peak body for Aboriginal education and training. And I was really lucky to be led by amazing leaders who have been in the sector, or in the education sector, but also just more broadly in the social sector for decades, and were really clear when I first started that, if I was there to listen and learn respectfully, then I was always welcome. And if I wanted to walk alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in my work, that I would be welcome to do so. And that's not to say that I go into every interaction thinking, oh, I've got a badge here that says I'm a certified ally and I can go in now. But it does make going into work situations, social situations, even going into community, it makes it a lot easier, because I feel that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most welcoming, compassionate, empathetic community that I've ever met, and they have every right not to be, but they are. And you do get a real sense of welcoming when you are going into work. So I think that there's always, and cultural protocols are a big thing. I would never go into an interaction or a work situation with mob thinking that I'm the authority or that I should be making decisions. I always see my job as going in to listen and to learn and to bring my skills and to build frameworks, infrastructure, policy, whatever the needs of community are, to do that in a co-design or a facilitator sort of way. Yeah, so I guess that's a roundabout answer to your question.
For sure. And I think it's really interesting, because when you look at Aboriginal community organisations and you look at the way that a lot of organisations are structured, there can be issues in who's going to be on the board, what cultural connection do those people need to have on the board. Issue that commonly comes up is whether a non-Aboriginal person should be on the board or should be in some sort of senior management role within an Aboriginal organisation. And my own personal view there is that it's awesome when you can have Aboriginal people leading Aboriginal organisations, because I think that is a fantastic model of self-determination. But when you don't have the Aboriginal person with that skill set, then having a non-Aboriginal person that has the right set of values, that really understands and can connect with community, has absolute good faith intentions, and also, even better as well, is willing to pass on knowledge, upskill Aboriginal people involved within that organisation, then that's how we can have amazing wins. Do you feel that as a non-Aboriginal person working in an Aboriginal organisation, there is a lot to be offered? Or is it really about taking away the opportunity of an Aboriginal person? I know I'm asking you a tough one here, brother, but I feel like this is something that maybe a lot of our listeners face on a daily basis.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I think, harping back to sort of the first answer I gave, I've never felt unwelcome in my work environments across the 8 years that I've been working in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander led organisations. I think I completely agree with your point. when the expertise is there and the lived experience is there, then absolutely the role should be filled by someone with that lived experience and that expertise. And within a community controlled org, that's going to be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person. I think, when I've come into my two roles, I have been able to address or fill a gap that was there in the org that needed filling. And yeah, that's not to say that there wasn't an Aboriginal candidate out there. It just happened that the roles that were advertised weren't identified. So I can't comment on why the organisations themselves didn't identify the roles, but both of those organisations were 90% plus Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and 100% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander board members. In both organisations, I was one of a handful of non-Aboriginal staff. I do think I see more colleagues, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in my network who are in similar positions, filling roles, going from organisation to organisation, and these are incredibly capable, professional people with that lived experience, which I think is only going to benefit both the public sector and the private sector.
For sure. And I think also, I feel like we're touching on a sensitive issue as well, to be honest, because when you dig deep into these issues, there's a lot of layers to this. But I also feel like when you can find amazing people like yourself working amongst Aboriginal organisations, it's a great way of bringing Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people together for amazing common purpose. And if we're ever going to achieve unity across these lands, these are the kinds of things that need to happen.
Yeah, I totally agree, mate. And I have only ever felt welcome in my work. And like I said to you before, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most welcoming, caring people community that I've ever met, that have probably ever existed. It's really, I've always been nurtured in my role, and yeah, like I said before, I've always been told that if I want to stand up alongside mob and walk with them on the journey, that I'm welcome, and that's empowering, and it makes me in my work want to work harder. It makes me really want to achieve that impact. And again, being conscious of not being the authority, adhering to all cultural protocols, going in and more than co-design. I think co-design is a difficult, kind of a bureaucratic word. More listening, learning, having that yarn, and then coming up with the mindset of, well, how can I apply my skills to ensure that what this community need is self-determined, and equipping them with that capability to be able to meet the ever-changing needs of their community, and doing it in a way that's place-based and self-determined.
Yeah, awesome. And why do you think that's the case? You spoke about Aboriginal peoples collectively being very, very caring and welcoming in terms of the people that have been Aboriginal that you've come across and worked with. Where do you think that level of care and level of making you feel welcome comes from?
Well, yeah, again, as a white fella, my perspective as a white fella is that there's 100,000 years of community, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been nurturing their communities and their families and country, which is their community and their family, for thousands and thousands of years. I look at it I've spent the last 4 years in economic development, and the businesses, the 450 businesses that I've worked with in that time, the vast majority of them, as soon as there's revenue, even before profit, they're investing in community programs. They're establishing them themselves, or they're investing in community programs to bring everyone up with them, which in a capitalist society, that just doesn't happen. You just don't see that. But that's the default setting that I've seen in my short time working in this sector. That's the default setting for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses is, if I'm operating on country, then I'm going to make sure that my community is cared for and nurtured and being supported whilst I'm, developing my enterprise. So yeah, I think that's that's just the default setting from my experience for mob, is that community-minded approach.
And you've spoken about business and economic development being a really good pathway forwards in terms of ensuring the continued efforts towards sustainability and economic improvement amongst Aboriginal communities. What sort of negotiations have you seen through business that can lead to better community outcomes through the model of self-determination?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in the last, my most recent role has been connecting Aboriginal businesses and communities with government and with funders. And government and funders, there's so much goodwill within the public service. There's amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working within the public service, and they're developing policies that centre self-determination. They centre intergenerational wealth. They're incredible. They're really sustainable strategies and policies. But the difficulty for government and for funders, and this is also happening in, trusts and foundations, is there's mob in there who are pushing hard to ensure that self-determination is front and center. But there's inherently a disconnect between what self-determination means or is defined within these strategies and policies and what it means to communities, businesses, individuals. So I see a real opportunity to bridge that gap, to increase capability within communities to be able to define that self-determined economic prosperity, what it means to their community, and then to develop the infrastructure to be able to go back to government or to funders or to industry and say, here's what we see as intergenerational wealth or as economic prosperity. Here's what we want to achieve. Here's how we're going to measure it. Let's go to work on achieving it. And I think, if you look at from a political perspective, and again, my white fella perspective, coming out of the last couple of years politically, it's been, really, really difficult for mob coming off the referendum, but shifting the view to the economic development and the Aboriginal economy, it is an unstoppable wave of enterprise, and government can't ignore that. Either side of government, whoever's in power, they can't ignore the contribution that Aboriginal businesses now are making to the economy. Matt, it's like the worst thing, but money talks. And when you've got an Aboriginal economy now that's the size of the timber industry, that talks in government, and that's, that allows Aboriginal communities that are economically strong and sustainable, that self-determination and that agency can come with that, both from a industry perspective, but also a policy and political perspective. So yeah, I'm buoyed by the landscape of it's not an Aboriginal economy because these businesses are operating across all industries and sectors, but they're growing, and it's the contribution that they're making is growing, and alongside what I was talking about before, their contribution to their community is growing as well, which can only be a good thing.
And you're speaking about, it's really awesome, the description of some of the landscape that you've given, and you were also speaking about the model of government policy making and self-determination in the way things are happening and developing through Aboriginal business. I wonder how there can be a higher level and better level of negotiation with those in government and decision makers within government to ensure better policy outcomes. Have you ever thought about this issue, and do you have any ideas about how we can be negotiating for better policies at that government level?
Yeah, well, I think, the best example I can think of is the treaty in Victoria. That, from a policy perspective, is that is going to completely, it is and has completely changed the landscape. And having worked really closely with Auntie Geraldine Atkinson when I was at VAI, and she was the co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly at the time, and going into meetings with her and hearing the conversations that Marcus Stewart and Auntie Geraldine and the assembly we're having, and then through the creation of the Treaty Authority and now the Self-Determination Fund, that really is a model for negotiation, and it's been built off 10, 11 years now of, well, decades and decades of work before that. But from a legislative standpoint, the last 10 years have been really crucial for building those frameworks of negotiation that have gotten us to where we are, which is a treaty in Victoria, which means that Aboriginal communities have a seat at the table and they're represented by a democratically elected body who inform those negotiations and that decision-making process. So I think if we can replicate that around Australia, that will go a long way to improving the negotiating position of mob with policy. Because I've also seen the other side where there's advisory groups, working groups for projects that are chaired by mob or, are filled by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And they're all well and good, but they are hamstrung by bureaucracy. They don't have any real decision-making authority. It's as they're named, an advisory group. And they're often, the participants or the members are not remunerated. It's, they're giving voluntary advice. There's complexities around the IP they're giving, how it's being stored, how it's being used. So I think having the really strong structures and infrastructure of treaty replicated at a state and territory level, at a traditional owner group level, which is also happening in Victoria, the individual treaties with TOs, that's the pivotal step, I think, to giving real agency to mob with negotiating policies and legislation.
Awesome. And you've really touched on a crucial point as well, I think, because when we're negotiating, I think it's really important to understand what is the outcome in the negotiations that we're wanting to achieve. And the treaty that's been formed in Victoria has received a lot of positive feedback as well as some negative backlash. And the main point that I've heard people speak of, there are others, but the main point that I've heard people speak of when it comes to negative backlash is the treaty is not formed of the position as to sovereignty, because the treaty takes all Aboriginal people in Victoria and says, this is the outcome for you people as Aboriginal people, rather than recognition of the clans that have always existed, continue to exist throughout the lands of Victoria. And so that principle of sovereignty has been diminished through the creation of treaty. If you look at the treaty as being a vehicle for maintaining sovereignty, well then perhaps it hasn't achieved the outcome. But if you look at the treaty as a way of giving voice, of giving credence, of giving the ability for Aboriginal leaders and elders throughout Victoria to ensure that Aboriginal peoples are heard on significant matters, and to ensure that lawmaking takes into consideration the perspective of Aboriginal peoples in Victoria, then the treaty is a really big win. So when it comes to negotiations, I think it's really important to be clear on what is the outcome that you're looking to achieve, and through the negotiation process, stay to those critical benchmarks of that outcome whilst being prepared to let go of some items to ensure the betterment of future outcomes through that negotiated outcome. And I think the treaty is a really good example of this.
Couldn't agree more. I absolutely couldn't agree more. And I'm really glad that you were able to articulate that. And again, this is another example of me as a white fella being in a really privileged position where I get to sit and listen to a proud Aboriginal man, tell me how it is from your perspective as a man with lived experience. So I really appreciate that, Matt. That's an amazing perspective giver.
Awesome, brother. I appreciate the feedback on that. The truth is, and this is also where some mistake can come sometimes by people out there in broader community, where they may hear one Aboriginal person's voice and think that's the collective position of all Aboriginal people, because there's very much a possibility of Aboriginal people listening to what I've just spoken, saying, no, Matthew, I strongly disagree. I think that giving up sovereignty through that model of treaty making really wasn't worth this outcome that's been achieved. And this is where I think as well we need to put our trust and faith in elders, in leaders throughout a negotiated process. And also I think sometimes when we look at treaty, there was a lot of negotiations over many years that took place to get to the outcome. And unless you have the minutiae of detail, sometimes it's difficult to critique an outcome unless you have the full facts of the information. But this is also where we need the right leaders, the right elders, the right people that are involved at the forefront of negotiation processes, particularly when it involves community outcomes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. And I think, that being able to witness Arnie Geraldine and Marcus and now Ruben and Nagara lead this process, it's been incredible. And I mean, I don't envy them because, like I said before, there's no amount of goodwill within the public service that can change the fact that it is the machine of government and it's a colonial government and these systems are 200 years old. And so to wind back, I mean, there's never going to be a way, no reparations, no amount of apology is going to wind back what's happened, but to build structures against that, that colonial, the overwhelming sort of colonial structure that's been in place for 200 years is such an admirable thing. And to keep going back and representing community and sitting at that table when you've had to fight so hard for the seat to finally get this sort of seismic thing over the line is just incredible. But also, yeah, I will always, again, keep coming back to me being non-Aboriginal and respecting and always listening and hearing the perspective of all mob that I speak to about things like this. But yeah, really, really have to admire the work of mob that have fought for this treaty over so many decades.
Where does your willingness to listen and ability to respect come from? And in what ways can more non-Aboriginal people embark on the same principles the way you have?
I think the first part, mate, is I feel incredibly lucky to have been raised in my family that I was raised in. My mum is an incredibly empathetic, compassionate person. Her thoughts, her first thoughts are always for others. And so grew up in a family that I was very lucky to grow up in the environment I did grow up in, but it was always front and center of our lives that people need to be respected, people need to be listened to. And I think having that perspective growing up and then going into the work that I went into, pretty quickly realized that, it's an absolute privilege to get to listen and yarn with mob every day and hear the stories, learn about the history, be taken on country, told about country. It's a blessing, and I feel an immense privilege. It's not. I don't find it difficult being in the work that I'm in. I never have. I've always felt really, really privileged. I think you can. There is a frustration on the other side of that when the debate around January 26 or how the Voice campaign was co-opted. It's like banging my head against the wall and saying, what is the problem with these white fellas who don't want to listen, don't want to hear the other perspective, because it's such a beautiful story told by, as I've said a couple of times, this incredibly welcoming, compassionate, understanding community of people. Yeah, so there is. I mean, I don't have the answer, mate, to how we can to make other white fellas stop and listen. All I can say is that, yeah, I feel very, very privileged to be in a position where I do get to yarn and listen and learn really actively listen and learn, because it's a real privilege.
I think that you did provide a really awesome answer, because you were speaking about your mother and you were speaking about the way that your upbringing was in a very values-driven, generous environment where you learnt empathy for others through your upbringing. And the contrast to that I've heard people speak of is racism can begin in the home. And I think this is a really powerful place for parents to negotiate with the minds of their children to ensure the honest, the genuine, the clear upbringing of unity, of respect and love across cultures. So I think that you gave a really good example of your upbringing and how being brought up in the right place, in the right environment, with the right values can create a connection between all people, Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people alike. If you could speak one message to organisations who might be wondering of some practical ways to be able to protect and enhance culture and apply some of the things you've been speaking about, because you've been speaking about listening to Aboriginal people, appreciating elders, becoming educated, being respectful. You've spoken these kinds of words in this yarn that we've been having. What are some practical ways that organisations can be embracing some of these principles to achieve community outcomes?
We're talking specifically non-Aboriginal organisations?
Let's speak of non-Aboriginal organisations who really want to achieve amazing community outcomes. They want to be able to apply some of these things you've been speaking of, like this listening, like education in the right ways, to be able to walk alongside, and that's your words you spoke before, walking alongside Aboriginal people to achieve proper self-determined, but they're behind the doors of a bureaucratic government office. How can these principles you've been spoken of be applied to negotiate the proper frameworks, the proper outcomes, without being lost in all the bureaucracy?
Yeah. I think, I'd go back to just how I have learned to approach my work, which is always with the understanding that I'm not the authority. Whatever the org or the traditional owner group I'm working with on any project, any conversation I'm having, they hold the authority. The IP belongs to them, and agency has to be with that community or org. So I can only give my perspective. I've only really worked in community-controlled orgs, Aboriginal-led orgs, but I think where I see there could be improvement from the private sector or from government is sustainably engaging mob. So if they're creating policies, programs, if there's funding opportunities, if a trust and foundation want to give money away, ensuring that the community that they're focusing their attention on, that they're targeting that program at, needs that support, has the resources to deliver the programs that are going to be funded, and is the authority in developing the programs or the work. I think there's so much goodwill, like I've said a couple of times, in industry, in philanthropy, in government. There's a lot of goodwill, but there's just not that time and effort put into properly engaging with the communities that they're trying to support, that they're wanting to support. Yeah, properly engaging with them, making sure that the agency and the authority is with that community, that they can maintain the IP on the work that's done, but also they have the resources to carry out that work and continue it, make sure it's sustainable. So I think that goes back to following, what I would call cultural protocols. And if there's not specific cultural protocols in place, go to the traditional owner group, go to the board of the organization that you want to work with, and ask them how they want to approach the relationship, the project, the conversation.
I love the work that you do, Woodrow, and I think that it's fantastic to be able to hear this perspective, because I think that the country of Australia would be a much better place if we had this kind of respect in all places, this level of listening across all organisations, and this level of awareness and desire to see the right outcomes happening. I think this is powerful in terms of what you're speaking. and the way you go about doing things. And really look forward to hearing people's feedback when they get to hear your wisdom in this area as a result of the episode.
Thanks, mate. Oh, sorry. I was going to say I don't consider it wisdom, and I'd credit all of the amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that I've worked with, become friends with, listened to, learned from. I credit them because, yeah, like I've said, and mate, you're a prime example of this, of, you know, welcoming, passionate, caring, friendly, approachable community. And so, yeah, like I said, it's a privilege to be able to do what I do.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the connections in community, the ability to work together in a united purpose, I think that the values, the community outcomes when you're working with Aboriginal people and community organisations is such an amazing part, and it's great to be part of these kinds of journeys. If there was one last thing, and just say this was the most powerful final thing you could ever say to those out there who wanted to be doing amazing work with Aboriginal communities, and this is your chance to inspire them, what words would you speak? What would you say to them right now if this was your chance to really change the world for the better?
Mate, I would say reach out. Reach out if there's a community in mind, or if there's a project, or if there's a sector, an industry that you're passionate about and you want to make change. Go and seek out the traditional owner group, the cooperative, whatever community controlled org is around, and go and have a yarn and sit down and make it clear that, you know, you are there to listen, actively listen, to learn, and to walk alongside that org or that community. And, you know, I would be very surprised if there was any orgs out there that would say, no thanks, we don't want your help. Because, yeah, like I said, I've only ever been welcomed into work environments that I've been in, and yeah, there is a real opportunity there for, like you said, non-Aboriginal people coming together and engaging with mob and creating meaningful and sustainable impact. But it does, and this is really good, or really strong point, that it has to be led by non-Aboriginal people, because I think on the other side, you know, the expectation is that mob educate non-Aboriginal people, and that has always been the way, and that expectation is, you know, it's not sustainable, because it's not the job of mob to educate non-mob. So if you are thinking about it and you want to engage and you want to try and have an impact, it has to be from a position of, you know, you're not the authority. You need to be culturally sensitive, and yeah, reach out to the traditional owner group or the co-op.
Awesome. Thanks for being part of the Rolling Through Negotiations podcast, brother. Thank you for the work you do and for sharing these insights and powerful ways of being able to connect worlds the way you've shared with us today.
Thanks, Matt. I really do appreciate the opportunity, mate. It's really nice to have a chat. And yeah, I look forward to listening to more yarns.
Loved having you here, brother, and stay connected with us. And remember, guys, if you've liked this episode, press that like button. Share this episode of Rolling Through Negotiations podcast and subscribe so we can keep on bringing you more great episodes just like this one.